Our next topic is going to be muscle tissue. So, putting this in perspective, remember back to our discussion of histology. There are four tissue types in the human body. So, we had epithelial, we've covered that in detail. Connective tissue, we've covered that in significant detail. Then we have muscle and nervous tissue. So, here's our discussion of muscle tissue. So, properties of muscle, there's contractility. And what I mean by contractility, yes, it's the ability to contract, but really what that means is the ability to generate force. So the ability to generate force. Excitability refers to the fact that skeletal muscle can be stimulated, and also other types of muscle too. It doesn't have to be skeletal. Extensibility refers to the fact that it can be stretched, and elasticity refers to the fact that if you stretch it out, it will recoil. So there's different types of muscle that you're well aware of. So we have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And the bulk of this lecture is going to be on skeletal, and we'll touch on cardiac and smooth towards the end. So focusing on skeletal muscle, functions are going to be movement, maintaining posture, body temperature, because when you contract muscle, it generates heat. So skeletal muscle can be used to generate heat and thus help maintain body temperature. If you look at this picture, you can tell that skeletal muscle is really organized, and that's a point I'm going to keep making throughout this lecture. So this is an individual muscle cell, which is called a fiber, and it's organized into these little bundles called fascicles, and then the fascicles form the entire muscle. So a muscle cell is a muscle fiber. So remember that term. Fiber means a muscle cell. So muscle is organized by connective tissue. So it's covered in these connective tissue coverings, and I'm going to go through the different levels. So if we look at an individual muscle fiber or a cell, which is this, it's covered by connective tissue called the endomysium. So each one of these is a muscle fiber, and they're surrounded by connective tissue called endomysium. So remember, all these muscle fibers get together and form bundles that are called fascicles, and each fascicle is surrounded by connective tissue that's called perimysium. So you can see these are individual fascicles surrounded by perimysium. And then the entire muscle, which is formed by all those fascicles, is surrounded by connective tissue called epimysium. So epimysium goes around the entire muscle. On top of that epimysium, you can also get some more connective tissue called deep fascia, which you're seeing here, which is going to fuse and merge right into the tendon, which goes to the bone. And so this is a very organized setup of skeletal muscle. So here's another picture of the covering. So this is a fiber, so that you have the endomysium going around it. And then we have the each fiber is, or the fibers get together and form a fascicle, and that's surrounded by perimysium. And then remember, all the fascicles we get together and form the entire muscle, which is not shown here, but that would be surrounded by epimysium. So other connective tissue associated with muscle, we have tendons, which connect muscle to bone. Here's a major tendon right here. This is your Achilles tendon connecting your calf muscle to your calcaneus. Aponeuroses are just tendons that are flat. So if you look in your hand right here, there's a big flat tendon that's called an aponeurosis. And then this will become second nature when we start identifying muscles, but each muscle is going to have an origin and insertion. And what that means is they're points of attachment. So if you look at this muscle, which you may be familiar with, this is the biceps brachii muscle. One end attaches to the scapula, the other end attaches to the radius. So one of those ends is called the origin, one's called the insertion. So these are already denoted. So each muscle it has an established origin and insertion, but the way they were named is that the origin is the less movable end, the insertion is the more movable end. So you can envision what would happen if this muscle contracted. It's more likely that your forearm is going to move than your scapula is going to move. So that would make the scapula the origin because it's less movable, and the radius the insertion because it's more movable. So as far as blood and nerve supply of skeletal muscle, it has lots. And what stimulates skeletal muscle to contract is actually the nervous system. So you have neurons called motor neurons, which you'll learn more about motor neurons when we cover the nervous system. but they stimulate skeletal muscle cells to contract. And we'll talk about that whole process in this lecture. All right, so if we go through the anatomy of a skeletal muscle cell or skeletal muscle fiber, it's very unique in what it looks like. It doesn't look like any other cell. So this is one muscle cell, one muscle fiber, one skeletal muscle fiber. So if you look at it, it looks very organized again. So there's your endomysium going around it, but you have all these little tubes in it. So each of these little tubes is called a myofibril. So make sure you keep this terminology straight. Myofibril is like a little tube inside of a muscle fiber. And we'll talk about what's in the myofibril soon enough. Now, you also see the striations, and we'll talk about why that is. And you already knew that skeletal muscle was striated. Then you see a lot of nuclei. Look at all these nuclei. And the nuclei tend to be on the outside of the cell, on the surface. But remember, skeletal muscle is multinucleated, many nuclei per cell. So other terms that are really important in skeletal muscle. So here's another picture. This is also a muscle fiber. So here's your the surrounding membrane, and then here's all your little tubes in it. Just a different picture. So these are the little tubes, would be the myofibrils again. So skeletal muscle has its own terminology. So the cell membrane of a skeletal muscle fiber is called the sarcolemma. The cytoplasm of a muscle cell is called the sarcoplasm. As we said, skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. You see the many nuclei here. There's lots of mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria are important for energy production, for ATP. So you need lots of energy in skeletal muscle, so there's lots of mitochondria. And then, like I said earlier, you have these tubes called myofibrils within the skeletal muscle cell. All right, so just to recap, you got the sarcolemma. Everything inside the cell is going to be the sarcoplasm. Lots of nuclei on the outer surface of the cell, lots of mitochondria, and you have tubes in here called myofibrils. Now, if we look at some other structures that we haven't gotten to yet, these yellow tubes, so if you look closely at these yellow tubes, they actually open up to the outside. These are called transverse tubules, sometimes just known as T-tubules. This is how you get electricity deep inside the muscle cell. So electrical signals are going to travel down these T-tubules deep into the muscle cell. All of this green stuff is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is a storage site for calcium. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is all this green stuff. It stores calcium. This is just loaded with calcium. Calcium is going to be really important in muscle contraction. And then we have myofilaments. So if you look inside of these myofibrils, so this is a myofibril as we've established, there's a bunch of smaller structures inside of that. And you can kind of see them here where they pull them out. These are called myofilaments. And if we zoom in on these, they look like this. And here's another picture. So if this is one of those myofibrils, which would be one of these, inside it you have myofilaments. So there's three types of myofilaments. You have actin, which is sometimes known as the thin filament. That would be this red one. You have myosin, which is called the thick filament, which is yellow in this picture. And there's a third one called titin that doesn't get a lot of publicity, but it's there and it plays a role in maintaining muscle length. So we'll talk about that briefly also. But most of the discussion is going to be on the actin and myosin filaments. So if we focus on the filaments, so the myosin or thick filament looks like this. If we zoom in on it, you can see it has all these little projections coming off of it. So it's made up of these. The filament itself is made up of a bunch of these. These are called myosin molecules. A myosin molecule kind of looks like two golf clubs with the shafts twisted around each other. So, and it's two heads. These heads are sometimes called cross bridges. And so if you get a bunch of these myosin molecules together, they form the entire filament, which would look like this. And you get all these little cross bridges or heads sticking off. This is important because this is going to allow the skeletal muscle to contract. So these myosin cross bridges sticking off of the myosin filament are going to basically allow the fiber to contract. It's also important that there's a site for ATP to bind here. Remember, ATP is used for energy. So when muscles contract, you need ATP, and that ATP is going to bind on these heads or these cross bridges. So the actin or thin filament looks completely different. So if you look at the filament itself, it looks like this red picture down here, and here's another picture right here that's blue. But basically it looks like two strands of beads twisted around each other. So if you kind of focus on this picture right here, you see if you had like two strands of pearls and wrapped them around each other, that's what the actin filament looks like. And it has some proteins that are attached to it. These proteins are troponin, which is more globular in shape, so it would be this structure right here. Actually, it has 3 subunits. You don't need to be familiar with the 3 subunits, though. Just know this is troponin. So here, here, and here. In this bottom picture, it would be blue. So this one, this one, this one, those are all troponin. And troponin is important because it binds calcium. All right, just remember that. So troponin binds calcium. And then the other protein is called tropomyosin. That's this long one. So it's a long rod-shaped protein. So in this top picture, it looks like it's kind of bluish or purplish. This bottom picture, it's green. So that's tropomyosin. So what tropomyosin does is it covers up these binding sites. So if you look back at this picture, you can see that the actin filament has a bunch of red or pinkish dots on it. Those are binding sites, sometimes called active sites. That's where the myosin cross bridges could attach. So what tropomyosin does is it covers them up and blocks them. So it's going to block them until you're ready for muscle to contract, and then something's going to happen to move it out of the way, and we'll talk about that later. So tropomyosin's job is to cover up those binding sites. Troponin's job is to bind calcium, and the rest is just this actin filament. Looks like 2 strands of beads wrapped around each other. So if we look at this picture, you can kind of see how the actin and myosin filaments are associated with each other. Now, in reality, you're going to have a bunch of these together, and I'll show you some more realistic pictures soon enough. But I did want to point this at this point, show you that the way the myosin filament is set up, there is the tail regions where there's no cross bridges tend to orient themselves in the middle, and the cross bridge regions are on the outside. All right, so there is kind of an area in the middle of the myosin filament where there's no cross bridges. If we zoom out more, it looks more like this. So again, you get that area where there's no cross bridges, and then the cross bridges look like they're on either end, and they look like they could grab onto actin if they need to. And we'll talk about that process later. All right, so zooming out even more, this is a picture that it might look somewhat similar, maybe not really, to the microscope slide that you've seen of skeletal muscle, but remember skeletal muscle is striated, so you see those striations? So this is why you're seeing the striations. It's the overlap of these actin and myosin filaments. So when you kind of zoom out and look at it from afar, it just looks like it's striped. And that striped appearance is due to the overlap of these actin and myosin filaments. So if we zoom out even more, it might look like this, but I think you get the idea. This is kind of showing you the overlap of actin and myosin, and so due to that, it makes the muscle have a striped appearance when you look through a microscope. So another term that I'm going to give you right now is called a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is a unit of one of those myofibrils. So I am going to see if I can find a better picture really quick to show you what a sarcomere might look like. Yeah, so I'm just going to go back to that picture of skeletal muscle. So remember, these are myofibrils. And if you just examine one of these myofibrils, it would be long like this. But if you can envision one of these myofibrils being divided into units, one of those units is a sarcomere. So if we took out this myofibril and maybe it looked like this, like a region from here to here, that would be one sarcomere. So a given myofibril is going to have plenty of sarcomeres running its entire length. but each sarcomere is the functional unit of that muscle fiber. So this would be, if you can envision, this is one section, this to here, that's one sarcomere, which basically means it's one section of one of those myofibrils. And again, the overlap of these actin and myosin filaments give skeletal muscle that nice striped appearance. So if we zoom out, this is a picture you're probably more familiar with. This is what skeletal muscle looks like through a microscope. And that striped appearance is due to the overlap of the actin and myosin. All right, so if we look at one sarcomere, we can actually identify different zones or areas within it. And I'm going to run through these, and these are really important for you to know where they are. So this is one sarcomere from here to here. So the edges of each sarcomeres are called Z-disc. So here and here, Z-disc or Z-lines. If we look at the middle of each sarcomere here, that midline is called the M-line. So Z-disc on the ends, M-line in the middle, just think midline. And then we have these different regions. So I'm going to start with the A-band. The A-band runs the entire length of the myosin filament. So from here all the way to here. And you can see it's labeled right here. So A-band runs the entire length of the myosin filament. The H-zone is this area from here to here. So it's best described as the region of the sarcomere where there is myosin, but there's no actin overlapping it. So H-zone has no actin overlapping it. So it's basically from here to here. Then we have the I-band. The I-band is the region of the sarcomere where there's actin, but no myosin overlapping. So that would be here, and it would carry over into the next sarcomere, which would be here. So I-band, region of the sarcomere where there's actin, but no myosin overlapping. And it does cross over into the next sarcomere. All right, those are your different zones and lines of sarcomeres that you need to be familiar with. And we'll talk about what happens during muscle contraction to each of those. So the third filament, which I said doesn't get a lot of publicity, is called titin. It basically is a big elastic and spring-like filament. So here's one sarcomere. So this structure right here, that's titin. And so what it does, it provides elasticity. So if you stretch out a muscle and the sarcomere stretches, titin will pull it back. And similarly, if you compress a sarcomere, like if you try to shorten it too much, it's going to push it back like a spring. So titin's job is to keep the sarcomeres at what they call an optimal length, to make sure that they don't get too long or too short for optimal muscle contraction. So I'm going to go back and show you one more picture of titin. In that previous picture, they drew it in this picture like a spring. So if you want to use this picture in your head, just envision what would happen if you stretched out this sarcomere too much. It would pull it back. And if you compressed it too much, it would push it back to the right length. All right, so some more terminology for you. Neuromuscular junction. Neuromuscular junction is basically where a neuron meets a muscle fiber. So this is called a motor neuron because it's coming out of the central nervous system going towards muscle. And this little junction right here is called the neuromuscular junction. So this is what stimulates skeletal muscle fibers to contract. You have electricity coming down this neuron, and it's going to stimulate the skeletal muscle cell to contract. But focusing on this is the neuromuscular junction. If we zoom in on it, you can see what it looks like close up. You're going to actually get little chemicals released right here, and that's going to stimulate the skeletal muscle to contract. We'll talk about that process shortly. All right, another term, motor unit. A motor unit is defined as a motor neuron and all of the fibers it innervates. So let me show you a picture. So this is one motor neuron. You can see it branches. The axon of this motor neuron branches. And in this case, it's going to 3 muscle fibers. So this would be one motor unit. It's one motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it's innervating or making contact with. So we have, just going back to this slide, we have different types of muscle fibers. We'll talk about that soon enough. But within a given motor unit, all muscle fibers are the same type. So long story short, we have fast twitch fibers, we have slow twitch fibers. So within a motor unit, either all the fibers are going to be fast twitch or they're all going to be slow twitch. And we'll talk about the different muscle fibers soon enough. Then we have big and small motor units. So a big motor unit, a large motor unit, would be like one motor neuron innervating 2,000 muscle fibers. That's about the biggest we have. Small would be like maybe 10. So one motor neuron innervating 10 muscle fibers. So if you think about functionality, when we want to generate a lot of force, we want to recruit those big, large motor units. So we tend to find those in the legs, because the legs, like your quadricep muscles, your gluteal muscles, generate a lot of force. They have very large motor units there. Whereas when you need more fine motor control, you would want those small motor units, so that don't generate a lot of force, but they can be very, very precise in what they do. So the smallest motor units we have are found in the muscles that control the eye, because you think of the eye movements, they have to be really, really fine-tuned. So again, this is a motor unit, one motor neuron, and all the muscle fibers it innervates.